皆さんこんばんは。このセミナーシリーズに関するご意見、ご要望を
We welcome your comments and requests regarding this series at info@isic-japan.org. Today's program features simultaneous interpreting in English and Japanese. To change the audio channel, click the interpretation icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. This program is organized by ISIC Japan, produced by Bloom Pacific, supported by CASA, Iden, SIDM, and sponsored by BAE Systems and Raytheon Technologies. Interpreted by Christopher Field and Paul Hershey, I would like to now turn the floor over to ISIC Chairman Masanori Nishi to chair this Defense Industry Forum on the topic of the Quad, Potential for Industrial Partnership, Building on Strategic Relationships in Space and Defense. Welcome to the ISIC web seminar. I am serving as the chair. My name is Masanori Nishi. I think that our Japanese listeners will have heard the English word quad before. In English, it means four of something. Recently, it has been used to refer to the relationship between Japan, the US, Australia, and India. In a Nikkei newspaper this month, there has been an editorial about this word, which, according to that editorial, tells us that the term first came up when Prime Minister Abe proposed a framework for a four-country discussion back in 2006. In 2017, Director General level meeting was held in 2017, and then the first foreign minister level meeting was held in New York in 2019. Followed by joint training exercises held a month later by the four countries' militaries. Tonight, we are fortunate to have speakers from each of those four countries. Brent Clark from Australia, who is the CEO of the Australian Industry and Defense Network. From India, we have Mr. J.D. Patil, who is president of the Society of Indian Defense Manufacturers. From Japan, we have Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi, professor at Keio University. And from the US, we have Keith Webster, president of the US Defense and Aerospace Export Council. We will hear from these four gentlemen about the security significance this cooperation has brought between these four countries, and also about the possibilities it holds from an industrial and technical standpoint. So let us start with Clark-san, Mr. Clark of Australia. Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nishi, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this Quad discussion. This is going to be a very important thing, I think, for all four countries going forward. What I will do this evening is give a brief introduction of the landscape in Australia from a defence industry perspective, and then talk more specifically about how partner companies can look at contracting into the Australian marketplace. Let me start with a quick description of what's happened domestically from an Australian perspective. Undoubtedly, like every country and everyone listening in, the globe has been affected quite significantly by the COVID-19 pandemic. Australia has been very fortunate in the way it has been able to deal with this, and of course our sympathies go out to many countries that have suffered great losses. Australia, like most of the world's economies, has had its economy impacted by this pandemic. Our exports have been impacted, as well as our domestic economy. The Australian government itself has legislated some of the greatest stimulus and social welfare packages of the modern era. And this will directly drive a debt of at least $1 trillion Australian dollars as we come out of this pandemic, which is a debt that the Australian economy has never seen previously. However, the government reaffirmed its commitment to all planned defence expenditure and actually increased it to include additional expenditure on cybersecurity. Of significance, because the Australian government has decided to decouple the defence budget from Australia's gross domestic product, This actually pushes the defence expenditure from 2% GDP up to an area between 2.3 and 2.6% GDP. This is a significant policy shift for Australia. Australia has tended to always link its percentage of GDP to 2%, and therefore if the economy shrinks, so too then does the amount of money available for defence. The Australian Prime Minister has identified defence as one of the areas of expected economic stimulus for the Australian economy. And again, this is a significant event from an Australian perspective, because this now drives a political element to acquisition for defence. Prior to the pandemic, the Australian government was coming under significant political pressure to ensure that there was more expenditure of the defence budget domestically. And this led to a series of reviews and undertakings being given by both the Minister for Defence and the Minister for Defence Industry here in Australia. Both ministers called for a number of reviews into how Australian programs would be tasked and how a domestic market could be increased. All of this means that there will be a high level of scrutiny on all defence programs to ensure that Australian companies are able to compete in a fair and equitable way for work share on the Australian programs. Increasingly, this will bring pressure onto the foreign-owned prime contractors operating in Australia to ensure that they can demonstrate that they are allowing Australian industries to compete in a fair and equitable way. What does this mean? There is a broad acceptance that Australian industry will still require assistance in many areas until they are able to undertake the required technology transfer, use of intellectual property, and developing the required know-how, know-why, and know-what to undertake these kinds of activities. This means that the opportunities for our Quad partners remains high. However, we need to look at the manner in which our partners can become part of the Australian programs. And fundamentally, there are two routes to this market. There is the simple route, so to speak, of providing sophisticated equipment that's not produced in Australia directly to the Australian government. And then in the vast majority of cases, there'll be the forming of relationships and partnerships with Australian companies so that they can transfer their knowledge and equipment for these programs. The formation of joint ventures and establishing subsidiaries in Australia are viable methods to increasing exports from our partner countries to the Australian programs. However, in the case, the vast majority of industrial opportunities for our partners will lie in becoming part of a defence project supply chain. Now, some facts. The Australian government will acquire over 275 billion Australian dollars of new defence equipment over the decade from 2021 to 2030. However, the total defence spend over this period will be in the order of 550 billion Australian dollars, which will include acquisition, sustainment, people, and the total defence ecosystem. This roughly translates to 55 billion Australian dollars per annum for the next decade. As I said previously, this drives the defence component of Australia's GDP up to somewhere around that 2.3 to 2.6%. The opposition, or the alternate government, if you prefer, in Australia, has not necessarily endorsed this strategy. However, it is highly unlikely at this stage that they would state an opposite view. So fundamentally, this remains the largest allocation of equipment modernisation in Australia's history post-Second World War. The government's ambition is to lift Australian defence exports as well to a level where Australia positions itself in the top 10 defence exporters globally. Now, that's obviously quite a challenge the government has set. The scope of the acquisition for Australia remains multidimensional. It's across all spectrums of defence equipment: maritime, land, air, cyber, and importantly, space. And Australia has begun the journey of creating a space industry here. Some political considerations. Since the 2019 election, most of the large contract wins have been announced. The next significant contract that will be announced for the Australian marketplace will be Land 400 Phase 3, which is some tactical fighting vehicles, and that will be several billion Australian dollars. Australian defence industry is not a large industry within the Australian domestic marketplace. Generally speaking, most Australian companies don't have 100% allocation to defence industry. They have a component of their order intake that comes from defence. And this can range from 10% up to 90%. Therefore, Australian companies have a very varied way of attacking the defence problem. A remaining challenge for the Australian defence industry is that its materials for most programs comprise about 55% of the total expenditure on all Australian programs. And that's quite a significant figure if you look at that kind of number, because Australia will be importing most of the materials for those kind of programs. And that obviously gives an opportunity for exports. The remainder of that the remainder of the expenditure fits basically under the broad program of labour. As I said, Australia as a country does not produce many of the components required for the types of programs in the Australian order line. Items such as fibre optic cables, electrical cables, connectors, pumps, displays, etc., are traditionally imported. And then the Australian company acts as the in-country equipment manufacturer, and it's vital that a reliable, cost-effective and quality overseas producer is sourced to ensure these components are available. As I said, because we produce so few of these components domestically, the opportunity to export these types of supplies to Australia remains a real opportunity. One area that the Australian government has reaffirmed is the creation of a sustainment of an Australian defence supply chain as a fundamental requirement for the country to achieve defence sovereignty. There remains tension between the government, defence, industry in the areas of Australian industry involvement. This tension is fundamentally created by the government's political desires, the expectation of industry, and unfortunately a poor definition of what an Australian company is. Currently in Australia, the definition of an Australian company is a company that has an Australian business number, and most of you will be familiar with some sort of business number in the countries that you operate in. This also works into New Zealand, as there's a very free trade between Australia and New Zealand. That definition also includes the subsidiaries of overseas companies and whether they be based in Australia or New Zealand. Defence is reviewing that definition and it will be considering a couple of possible amendments to that. However, I won't go into that now. I'm very happy to supply that individually if people would like to make contact. As I said, the government has undertaken several reviews and tasked Defence to liaise with industry on these matters. What we need to be looking at here is, and understanding is that from a political perspective, to be able to achieve an export opportunity for your companies and for countries, we'll need to work collaboratively with the in-country Australian organisations. In Australia, the Capability and Sustainment Group remains the area within Defence that is responsible for acquisition and sustainment. It is part of Defence, but it is a separate entity in the fact that it effectively is the purchasing agency of the department. It is also increasingly responsible for the acquisition within the Department of Home Affairs, because there are many applications within the Home Affairs Department that are quasi-defence. Again, CASG has come under increasing pressure to ensure that a greater expenditure of the defence budget is allocated to Australian industry. As we move forward, I would like to talk about where I think defence industry is going. As I said, the Australian defence industry remains relatively small and it's dominated by large foreign-owned traditional defence prime contractors. Prime contractors very much like Raytheon, very much like BAE Systems, Thales, etc., Lockheed Martin, to name a few. However, medium-sized foreign-owned subsidiaries are also establishing themselves in the domestic market. This does cause some friction with Australian-owned businesses. However, the current government has a requirement to establish its sovereign industrial capability. And this means that the bonding of these organisations will need to occur. I need to emphasize that there are and there will remain potentially very significant opportunities for collaboration and export from India, from Japan, and from the US into Australia. The Australian defence marketplace, as I said, is quite small. Australia is dominated primarily by the offshore oil and gas industry and the mining industries. So defence industry, being quite a small element of that, doesn't tend to be so relevant in the eyes of the Australian public. Now, obviously, the Australian defence industry has thrown its full support behind the government's commitment to increasing defence exports. And it's through this endeavour that the defence industry will be able to increase its ability to influence and drive more positive outcomes for the sector as a whole. Significantly, the Australian defence industries that are becoming most influential are those which have moved from foreign managed companies to locally managed companies. The perception of Australianisation is vital for success within the current Australian market. It is well understood by all that Australia will not be manufacturing components and sub-elements of systems. It simply is not cost effective to establish the required infrastructure to do that. What is required is the ability to source these elements from trusted and secure supply chains in order to ensure that operational capability is not compromised. And I think this is a significant point for the members of the Quad to understand. The Australian government will be driving down this path of enhancing its relationships with India, with Japan. Obviously got a very good relationship with the US, but from a strategic point of view, the Australian government has certainly identified the Quad as vital to the sovereignty and security of Australia going forward. Australia, like all the Quad members, is what I would call a first world procurement country. Australia is a middle power, both in terms of military and economy. It is extremely important to approach the Australian defence market from the position of dealing with a sophisticated and informed customer. It is also important to acknowledge and accept that the Australian government and Department of Defence are heavily influenced by the United States military. This does not mean that US companies automatically secure contracts. However, the US military's advice is sought, advice is offered, and advice is quite often accepted in the vast majority of acquisition programs. Indeed, if we look at the two main maritime programs, the Future Submarine and the Future Frigate, the US is heavily involved in an advisory capability in those programs. However, having said that, Australia has a long history of acquiring the most capable equipment on offer internationally. It has acquired weapons and weapon systems from the US, the UK, Sweden, Germany, Italy, and France, just to name a few. It has also acquired combat systems from the US, France, and Sweden. So historically, it should be assumed that Australia will source what it believes to be the most capable systems, irrespective of country of origin. Having said that, the only other suppliers of military equipment that Australia will not source from will be China and Russia. And I'm sure that's not going to surprise too many in this group. When dealing in this environment and it's understood, particularly given the fact that you're operating in an international environment, Australia is well versed in having agents and representatives of companies in here to assist, to talk through, and to provide advice. It's very important, if you choose to go down that path, and very much for the listeners into this webinar, it's very important that when you approach the Australian market, that you do your research and you actually secure the services, if you're going to go down that path, of appropriate people. Like any country, there are people that are willing and quite often can imply that their knowledge of the Australian market is greater than what it is. And I hope that translates well with our interpreters. It's also important to understand that there is a shift in how defence is undertaking acquisition. The department is moving to require the large prime contractors and major service providers to take on the role of full management of the supply chain. So what does that mean? So in effect, if I use the example of, say, BAE Systems would be the prime contractor for the Future Frigate, and the department would expect BAE Systems to manage all the tier 2, tier 3 subcontractors. So basically BAE Systems sits between the department and the supply chain. However, it still makes business sense to initially engage with the department. The reality today is that companies will be directed to the relevant prime contractor as they are responsible for that engagement. However, if the department does not know about your capabilities, the department will become concerned in terms of you being employed and utilised in that supply chain. Industrial engagement, for the most part, is likely to be the avenue for entry into the Australian market. And there are three methods that I would recommend for this. Firstly is to establish a subsidiary, and that's quite common practice in Australia. Establishing a joint venture, and that joint venture, between your company and an Australian company. And of course, then there's direct export to an Australian company who acts as your in-country agent. Any of those methods are acceptable avenues to enter the Australian marketplace. The method chosen will ultimately be determined by you undertaking a business case. For all interactions, whether it be at the industrial, political, departmental, media, or etc. level, it is very important to understand that you need to form solid relationships. You need to be bringing a capability into the country, and you need to be willing to do a transfer of intellectual property to Australia. The Department of Defence is insistent upon having access to and rights to use intellectual property. The Australian Department of Defence expects the technical know-how to be transferred to the Australian marketplace, and the Australian Department of Defence therefore traditionally looks to the supply chain after acquisition to be grown to be quite Australian-centric. As an example, the current submarine in Australia, the Collins-class submarine, achieves something in the order of about 92% Australian industry involvement. Now, a lot of that Australian industry involvement is in partnerships with foreign-owned companies, and there's absolutely no issue with doing that. So I don't want anybody to walk away thinking that Australia has an anti-foreign policy. That's absolutely not the case at all. The policy that Australia has here is mutual benefit. And quite clearly, from a Quad perspective, if you're looking at opportunities into the Australian market, given the fact that the Australian government is driving towards having a greater domestic export priority, a mutual benefit would obviously the Australian government would look towards is Australian industry being able to export into your home markets as well, which is where the creation of subsidiaries and joint ventures becomes quite effective. With that, I think I've probably said enough, and I'll let others now speak. I will finalise the fact that Australia is a very viable marketplace. It is politically very stable. It has high degrees of lack of tolerances for corruption and those sorts of things. So when dealing in the Australian environment, whether that be political, departmental, or industrial, you can deal with those entities with a high degree of confidence that what is agreed and what is said will be honoured. And of course, finally, from my personal perspective, as we represent in excess of 1,500 Australian defence companies, we would be very keen to facilitate the exchange of data, information, and bring companies together so that we can look at how we can mutually benefit each other from this endeavour. Thank you for listening, and I guess we'll go to. I'll wait to see if anyone's got questions later on.
ありがとうございました。オーストラリアのマーケットについて非常に詳しく解説をしていただき感謝をしております。それでは次にインドのパティルさん、お願いいたします。
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. I must say that the pandemic was a global challenge, and of course, India has been able to do a little better on managing the pandemic. The early months of past 1 year has been a series of lockdowns that we have seen in India. Obviously, when you stop the industrial work and virtually shut the economy, the first quarter for the financial year 2021 obviously saw our economy shrink by nearly 23%. We've done well enough in the subsequent 9 months that we are closing today. Our financial year ends today, 31st of March. And as India, we bounced back. We hopefully expect to be closing this entire financial year somewhere about between 5 to 6% degrowth over the previous year. But what it also means is the coming year is going to be seeing double-digit growth, and it's going to be expected somewhere closer to about 13 to 14% growth, as we all see it from the industry executive shoes. The pandemic obviously brought in enormous amount of opportunities as well, because this is a period which we have seen unprecedented, exactly nearly about a century later that there's something of this kind happening. And as a result, India became very, very quickly, in a very, very focused way, self-reliant in almost anything that was needed to fight the pandemic. Besides the testing kits and the various, I would say, overalls and sanitizers and varieties of kind of requirements, right up to the ventilators, and creating that kind of a mass market in India, gave opportunities to a lot of our industry who very, very quickly responded. The good part was very quickly there's a vaccine around. India today produces 720 million doses every month, and that's a scale which, sorry, 72 million doses a month. That's a scale which we reached as of now, and we expect two more producers to be coming on stream in exactly 2 months' time. With that, we expect, as of today, if about 30-35% of the population of India, which is little above 35-40 years of age, we should be able to vaccinate them all in about 5 months' time. So that's essentially where India seems to be managing the show well. Last 2 weeks, we do see some amount of constraint on initiation of the second wave, multiple mutations we see, and that's a challenge. This is an era which we have also seen directly our borders getting hot. And while we speak of Quad, that's the India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, we all talk of one single elephant in the room, and that's China. Essentially, it's the same Chinese who decided to knock at our borders, and there has been literally, I must say, hand-to-hand fights. And that's something which India directly experienced. And as a result, during this pandemic year, when our economy was under stress because of the varieties of lockdowns, right midst of the lockdowns was the border getting hot. So it only enhanced India's resolve to be part of a very, very strong kind of an international relationship. It's a very clear resolve to have partnerships right across. And that's essentially what is visible over last 9 months of what India has done in terms of the policy front. We are a nation which few years back, I can say till recent years, 4-5 years back, we used to be the largest importer of defense equipment. And we had our space industry completely centralized within one research cum user organization, which was called the Indian Space Research Organization. Both these sectors who matter for the purpose of security a lot, because we can't today differentiate defense and space, and these are both completely now open. And these open sector mean for industry like all of us who are on this webinar an enormous amount of opportunity for coming together. What we all saw as Society of Indian Defence Manufacturers was an enormous amount of engagement with the government and the powers to be and the leadership. And obviously, as a result of this, we have ensured enormous amount of good policy measures that are initiated by the government. What I would do in next few minutes is to talk about some of them. We've been able to balance between the focus that we want to gradually shift towards being self-reliant, and this self-reliance, the Prime Minister of India called as Atmanirbhar. Atmanirbhar is a Sanskrit word which literally translated would mean being self-reliant. And that's essentially what is the kind of mantra which the Prime Minister founded as a part of this very scenario during the pandemic. While the borders have been getting hot, there was enormous amount of initiative to bring in new startups, new innovations. And you know, when we talk of innovations, India specializes in terms of very, very frugal innovation. And that's more so because India is blessed with our geopolitical, the demographic dividend that India enjoys. We have a power of youth, and the power of youth charged up can do wonders. We see that across the globe, the entire tech industry in the world and dominated in the United States, obviously are Indian-born CEOs who obviously have migrated and done wonders. And that's essentially is the same kind of the young chaps. That's what drive our ability to innovate. And the policies are today ensuring that this is allowed, sort of promoted, facilitated very, very specifically. As the government opened these sectors, this year has seen in the defense scenario an unprecedented steps that the government took in making the defense industry very, very friendly to the industry that is participating in this part of national endeavor. We have seen this year that there's a new acquisition policy that got unveiled. It's for the first time the government of India said we are not going to be government sector focused, and we're going to be treating the government and the non-government sectors absolutely on a level playing field. We actually have also seen this year that the indigenization has been given enormous amount of focus, and the government made its resolve that we shall not here onwards import anything that the Indian industry is capable of doing. And to start with, the government announced a positive indigenization list, call it in the parlance of negative import list for 101 military systems. The second list of 101 military systems, we expect today, tomorrow, any day now, as the government committed to do it by 31st of March. Now, that makes it little more than 200 systems that necessarily would now here onward get built. And that does not have to be only by Indian companies doing research on their own, because if we start at that stage, it would mean that it would take us years to be able to produce, and that brings in an enormous opportunity to team up. This teaming up is of multi-layered. The government actually says that any foreign company can walk into India if they want to own equity here up to 74%. They can come in and they can straight away set shop without any prior approvals of the government system. If it's more than 74, and there are companies who would want to guard their, I would say, intellectual property far too fiercely, can set even a 100% owned company, as long as they produce here in India for Indian use and as well export it out, Government of India is perfectly fine with it. While we are doing this on one side, on the other side, the government also very clearly is focused on, as I said, the self-reliance, and there are certain categories of acquisition which is focused purely towards the Indian industry. If I sum up the total quantum, I would say that roughly about 80% of the acquisition going forward, what would possibly happen over the next 5 years of time, has actually been put into the basket of Indian industry. Some, the Indian industry is able to do completely on its own, and the rest would obviously be through the teaming up arrangements. And that brings in enormous opportunities going forward for industries, the mature ones, right from US, Japan, Australia, India, all of us selectively teaming for specific focus. India has had enormous amount of successes on the strategic defense side. And of course, that's an area, while India is responsible enough to say no first use, we actually have built the space and the defense technologies on the strategic side completely on our own. And that gives an ability to India to be absolutely confident when we talk of self-reliance going forward. This is an year which has also seen an enormous amount of focus coming from the government, although it began typically about 3 years back, on focusing on exports, because we have large amount of imports. We also must have enough amount of exports to match, looking at it purely from the commerce perspective. Now, this is precisely where a new policy has now been drafted, and it's still under the considerations, but we see an early implementation of this policy actually happening. And the policy is called Defense Production and Export Promotion. And that export promotion is very active participation by the government and the government functionaries at various other places globally to be able to build up and create those kind of opportunities for Indian companies and their foreign partners to be able to sell overseas. The budget this year, which has just been announced for the financial year that starts tomorrow, and we have a full 1 year ahead, has been very significantly reprioritized. And I focus on the word reprioritization. While the budget per se hasn't grown much, fact remains that our borders were actually seeing hand-to-hand battle without bullets being fired. And given that scenario, there's about $3 billion of additional spend government incurred. Now, this $3 billion of additional spend, obviously in a normal year, would have come in from within the existing defense budget. And this was I would say, a trend changer, that the government provided this $3 billion for the emergency purchases in addition to the defense budget. Thus, going forward, we see the next year budget has a small increase inclusive of this $3 billion over and above what otherwise India was to do. And of course, with that, our capital budget allocation actually has seen an enormous amount of increase. The capital budget allocation, which means direct business to all of us in industry in terms of what the government will buy and physically pay for, has gone up 19% for the budget year starting tomorrow. Now, 19% in one given year has to be seen on the backdrop that the capital allocations increased 10% last 2 years, year on year. So as of within 3 years of a period, we see more than 40% plus extra allocations, which are now happening. And that's essentially where it opens up a new kind of a vista for industry in India, as well as their partners, to look up to this kind of opportunity going forward. I must touch upon, besides the defense, and when we talk of the joint ventures, I would focus very significantly not only on the JVs, but on the joint development and joint production. When we talk of joint development, we know that India can do it very frugally at a very different price point. And the point towards that is essentially whatever we did completely indigenously in terms of right from design to offering those services to the masses in India, like the space opportunities in India, the space related developments in India, we are by far the most successful and the least expense space launch systems in India. Now that's something which makes an enormous amount of statement going forward. The Department of Space used to have all eggs in ISRO's basket. Going forward, we are actually going to be seeing ISRO focus only on the future research and the space related studies and only doing their developmental launches. The entire launching market is now shifting to a government owned entity, and simultaneously to do the while that is being done simultaneously, the launch segment is completely being opened. So whether it's a satellite building, whether it's a launch segment, whether it's a service using your own assets in space for varieties of uses, right from earth observation to varieties of security applications, all of it now is open to anybody in industry. This is a domain which will mean enormous amount of partnerships. And when I say within the Quad, we know each of us have enormous amount of capabilities in this domain. And these are something which could be brought in together when we look at going forward. I see huge amount of opportunity in the space arena. There's a specific regulator who has been created because India is not someone who can afford having yet another set of launch pads and different kind of infrastructure. So there's a regulator who's been created by the government who will actually apportion the usage of these assets between these private companies who would want to do it now, or the non-government sector who's been allowed to get in, as well as the government sector. And that's essentially where we see there's going to be a fair treatment going forward, equal opportunity being provided when it comes to the government-owned sector as well as the non-government-owned sector. All it means is when we talk of the Quad members, there's a special relationship that was started by our political leaderships across our countries. That's something which now needs to be moving down to the industrial friendship and industrial cooperation. We need to be obviously looking at these opportunities to build our bridges, come together, and of course, towards that, decoupling all of our supply chains and manufacturing. The pandemic taught us that when our supply chains have been long, they've been not something which every nation suffered out of that, and that's not something any one of us would love to. Between friends and the friendly nations, it's far, far easier, not when it comes to having all our eggs in supply chain put into China. And that's essentially where we see India to be a extremely viable option with the quantum of talent available, with the quantum of investment friendliness which has come in, foreign direct investment easing out. The corporate taxation has been slashed. And I must say that what we all used to pay 2 years back and what we pay now is nearly 30% lower. If a new industrial outfit is created for something which is significant in technology and related industries, the taxation is nearly half of what it used to be earlier years. And that's essentially where we are actually becoming a nation which would love to do this more and more and provide an enormous amount of viable option, most competitive taxation regimes, and a single tax right across the nation in the form of the goods and services tax that India adopted about 4 years back. So as a result, I see that between the Quad members, there's obviously doors open. There's very, very clear policy India follows, and that's essentially what we call as look east, act east. And that's essentially where there's an enormous amount of focus India is today putting in. I think with that, I would want to stop and take some questions at a later time. Thank you so much. Thank you for patient listening.
ありがとうございました。インドもやはり自国の産業というものを大事にしているという点では、オーストラリア、あるいは日本と同じであろうかと思っております。それでは次に日本から谷口さん、お願いいたします。ちなみに谷口先生と私は大学時代同じ指導教授にお世話になっておりました。古いお付き合いのあるお友達です。どうぞお願いいたします。
西さん、ありがとうございます。谷口智彦と申します。昨年の
Thank you, Mr. Nishi. Tomohiko Taniguchi here. Last year, when Prime Minister Abe retired due to ulcerative colitis, he had been in place, his administration had been in place for 7 years and 8 months. And this was the longest continuous administration in modern Japan history. And the biggest goal of that long administrative history was, if we look back on it, the start of this Quad and the nurturing of this Quad that we're talking about. As you see in my cover page here, I'm talking about the possibilities for the for industrial cooperation, but really it shouldn't say possibilities, it should say the necessity. This is something that's limited. These are things that even for US, it's difficult to do by themselves, certainly for Japan. For Australia, India, Japan, and the US, we need to cooperate. There is a necessity for us to cooperate on everything. But for Japan, within this chain, we were the weak link. And that weak link, it seeks to become a stronger link that can supply the whole, or that can support the whole. And I think that the person who put that forth was Prime Minister Abe. The reason I can say that so definitively is that Prime Minister Abe's within his administration, I was in the Prime Minister residence almost every day, working with and helping the Prime Minister. It's because of that experience that I have that I can say that. We overcame many obstacles and brought Japan to the point where we could have this Quad relationship. That was not a simple thing. So I would like to look back on that first of all. Next page. What? Now the question is, what changed? Without this change, these changes, we would not have been able to talk about industrial cooperation and the rest of this. Next page, please. Until I've got this written up here. Until very recently, we were not the age during which we could do nothing at all lasted for a very long time in Japan. In 1976 February, 45 years ago, the Prime Minister at the time, Takeo Miki, said in the National Diet, he talked about a unification of the party. And he said then, regardless of who the other party may be, we are going to refrain from exporting weapons. And it says, regardless of who the other person may be. Only the U.S. Becomes relaxed eventually from this policy, but basically the sending of military equipment and technology was something which could not be done during all of that period. Therefore, to the customs of selling weapons and the experience of cooperating with other countries in that process was not nurtured whatsoever. And I say not whatsoever. I still am surprised by this as I look back on it.
Turn to the next page, please.
Next page. Thank you. Prime Minister Abe, in 2012, on December, became once again Prime Minister. Within just 1 year, he created what had not existed in the past, a National Security Council and a National Security Secretariat. Today, there are many Japanese attendees to today's webinar, and there are many people I know. For those individuals, it may be obvious. However, what I'm talking about now to people from India or Australia or other countries may recall some new memories to you. These may be changes that you can recall. This NSS and NSSC were created only 3 months thereafter. We had principles regarding the export of equipment and weapons. I have circled those in red, the key word here being transfer. The position had been that nothing must be transferred to let us transfer. In other words, we went from prohibition to encouragement, a 180-degree regime change. This 180-degree about face, if it had not taken place, then I would probably not have been invited to this meeting, and there wouldn't have been a Quad. Next page, please. What is set forth here is a strong framework that was created. This framework is a vessel, and we must fill this with many fruitful results, and that is my next issue or my next problem. First, I'd like you to look at this, please. The U.S. Has a memorandum regarding to the Mutual Security and Procurement Act. Defense, the countries with which it has signed this agreement in India and Pacific are just Australia and Japan. Japan has acquired or is expected to acquire in total 147 F-35s. So, since it will be buying those, it also needs a location for maintenance and repairs, and it, together with Australia, is going to be supplying that maintenance depot. So this is a very important point. Japan and Australia will be a place where the F-35s from various countries will come. In 2014, July, 2015, December, they formed what is called the AEDTT relationship. This AEDTT forms a certain template. Even just yesterday, Japan has entered into an agreement with Indonesia that was in the news. The projects being promoted under that, as listed here, include robotics and advanced technological examples. The first example, I think, is a very ambitious one. Next, please. In 2020, August of 2020, this was with the U.S. C4ISR capabilities. We started on some very important joint research work. With Australia in 2019, November, we formed the program that you can see. In particular, the idea is to interchange between scientists and technologists. Page 14. The members of Quad, as you can see, AEDTT, this is an industrial cooperation, AXA, this is cost-sharing cooperation, ASI, which is a agreement on the security of information. These three together make up a full helping. That full helping or fully formed portion that we now can see Japan is able to fulfill. Please confirm for yourself. Next, please.
Next page.
Next page. TrueSize.com. There is a site. This TrueSize.com is intended to overcome the illusion that is created by the Mercator projection map. It shows China, picks up China as though it were a pin set, and to show the map on the left. As you can see, continental Europe is virtually completely covered by China. China's offshore, the UK's offshore balancing becomes impossible. If you bring it over the North American continent, the only thing that it doesn't cover is Alaska. So the size, the scale is, I think, within the Quad, something which only Indo and Japan really feel. India and Japan are in contact with China across the sea, but if you separate a little bit further, you can really feel this size of this. Let's look at the next page. The Quad is TINA, it says. Prime Minister Abe, at his beginning of his regime, used this word. This was something that Margaret Thatcher liked. There are no other alternatives. If you abbreviate that, that's TINA. There are no alternatives. On the globe, you have Australia at the bottom, Japan at the top. Look at the right, you have India. At the very left, you have Hawaii. So this is a very broad space created by Quad. The East China Sea and the South China Sea both are contained within it. So this geopolitical space is what Prime Minister Abe called the Indo-Pacific space. the question of whether we can cooperate or not is not the question. We have to do so. That's why it's a TINA situation. Next page, please. In Japan, what do we need to do? We have insufficient experience. That is a serious problem. Next page. This is the last page of my presentation. Until now, Japanese industry has never done such things, is what it says here. Deliver at competitive prices. This type of equipment is something we've never done, so it's high cost. And in addition, even more important, the selling of equipment and military equipment in particular, which implies or anticipates a war situation, is something that we have never done. These are tools that are used in war. So to anticipate the supply of equipment for a war is something that we have never done, and within our current law is something that we will not do. Also, with respect to the U.S. and U.S., other than with the U.S. and U.S. industry, our experience, our cooperation with other countries is very little. So I don't mean to end in a pessimistic tone, however. The reason is that we have TINA and we have the Quad. Will the Quad become something like NATO? I frequently receive that question, but that is just too far out still. We need to get the experience as a regular, we need to get the habit. And so with Japan, Japan, India, Australia, and the US, we need to continue our discussions, even if they don't relate directly to defense. That daily habit is what will lead us eventually to the institutionalization, I believe. With respect to the outside, we need to be open. This year, HMS Queen Elizabeth will come to Japan with those battle forces. What will be on that ship will include American F-35s. So the Royal Navy comes to Japan, but it's coming together with the U.S. It's a multiplier of Quad. That is, that UK, France, perhaps Germany as well, serve. That's how I look at this. That concludes my talk. I've talked about Quad that couldn't have existed without the changes that Japan brought about. And it's not a question of whether it can or can succeed. We must succeed. And for Japan's defense industries, we still have insufficient experience, but in the future, we will work within this framework that has been created and embark on many ventures. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Professor Taniguchi,
thank you very much
for that.
Dr. Taniguchi.
As to the background of
We've
the
talked
Quad,
about the
political,
carefully. You've
strategical
talked carefully about the
background.
political and strategic background to Quad, and I appreciate that. Finally, I would like to. I'm sorry to keep you waiting, Mr. Webster. Hear from you.
Okay, thank you very much.
ありがとうございます。
This is an excellent opportunity to join
素晴らし
in
い
this
機会を
discussion.
与えていただきありがとうござ
I
います。
am grateful for the opportunity to
本
do
当に
so.
感謝しています。
Domestically, the
国
administration
内
is
的には
focused
米
on
国
the
政権は
pandemic
ですね、バイデン
the
政権は
economy
パンデミックに集
and
中して、
rebuilding the
そし
middle
て経
class
済
in
に集
America.
中して、アメリカの
I believe many of our
中産階
allies
級の再
and
建に
close
注力を
partners
しています。
globally
世界の同
are
盟国や
approaching
親
this
しい
year
パートナーの多くも
with
ですね、
similar
パンデミ
focus
ック
given
の
the
影響
pandemic.
を受けて、同じように今年を迎えようとしているのではないかと思います。
However, none
し
of
か
us
し、
can
私
afford
た
to
ちは
lose sight of the
国
threats we
家安
face
全保
from a
障の
national
観点から
security perspective.
直面する脅威を見失うわけにはいかないです。
A critical national security matter for the
米国に
United
とって
States
重要な国
remains
家安
the
全
great
保
power
障上の課題
competition
は、米
between
国
the
と
United States
中
and
国、
China
そして米
and the
国と
United States and Russia
ロシア
to a
の
lesser
間の
degree. President Biden has a clear-eyed view on the matter of China and what challenges China presents for America, our allies, and close friends.
視点を持っています。
Economic coercion,
経済的な
intellectual
強
property
制力、
concerns,
知的財産の問題、軍拡、
global port
港
construction,
湾建設など
a
も
brash
そうです
diplomacy
し、ま
campaign,
た、
Hong Kong,
香港、インド、
India, and the line of action and control,
行動と管理の
and the
線
South
引き、
China Sea.
南シナ海などの問題もあります。
The administration is working on
バイ
its
デン
China
政権は中
policy,
国政策
but
に対して
recognizes that first,
取
the
り組ん
U.S.
ではい
must
ます
get its
が、
domestic
まずは
house
米
in
国
order.
の国内事情を整理しなければいけないことを認識しています。
To do so, this has meant passing
先
the
日行わ
COVID
れた
stimulus bill, which was recently
景気
done.
対策法案が成立
The
しまし
next
た。
objective is a
次の
massive
目標は
infrastructure investment
超党
bill,
派の支持
which
を
has
得ている大規
bipartisan
模
support,
なインフラ
as these
投資法
investments
案で
will
す。
jumpstart
これ
the
らの投資
decoupling of
は
U.S.
主要分
dependence
野
on
に
China
おける米国の
in
中国
key
への依存
areas
を解消する一方
while
で、
ensuring we pull ahead
国家安全保
other
障上
technology
重要と
disciplines
考え
deemed
られる
critical for national security purposes. Critical technology, including beyond 5G, hypersonics, space, rare earth minerals, and processing of those minerals are some key investment areas. The White House task force formulating the administration's China policy is working to harmonize several challenges. How to address competitiveness at home, national security challenges given the rise of China's military, allied and partner nation equities and vulnerabilities, environmental collaboration with China, just to mention a few. The goal is to publish this administration's China policy by July of this year. Okay. Our Congress is focused as well. The Senate will turn its attention to China legislation, in addition to other priorities, when it returns next month from a spring break. Multiple committees will have hearings and markups on bipartisan legislation designed to bolster American competitiveness and counter the growing economic threats we face across the globe, especially from the Chinese Communist Party. The centerpiece of any China bipartisan bill will be the Endless Frontier Act, which was introduced last year by Senator Todd Young, who is a Republican, and Democratic representatives in the House. The bill would expand the National Science Foundation and rename it the National Science and Technology Foundation. It would also establish a technology directorate within the foundation to advance technology in 10 critical focus areas. Those areas include artificial intelligence and machine learning, high performance computing, semiconductors and advanced computer hardware, quantum computing and information systems, in addition to others. The proposed technology directorate would receive $100 billion over 5 years to lead investment and research in the 10 focus areas, and an additional $10 billion would be authorized to designate at least 10 regional technology hubs. The goals for this legislation are to boost US competitiveness while investing in innovation and manufacturing, strengthening ties with strategic partners and alliances such as NATO, Southeast Asia, and India. And finally, ending predatory practices like those of China. So once our American house is in order, which should be clearer later this year, the US will lean harder on allies and friends to harmonize our perspectives of the national security risks and how to decouple from China to minimize vulnerabilities and to limit Chinese influence. So, where does the Quad fit in this US strategy? China is an adversarial power seeking to displace the United States from the Indo-Pacific to reorder the region in its favor. In response, Washington has been reinvigorating its alliances and strengthening ties with partners not only bilaterally, but multilaterally as well, and the Quad is one such multilateral mechanism. Washington's key objective when contending with Beijing in the Indo-Pacific is to preserve the liberal international order that has been in place since the end of World War II. The Quad, whose 4 members are democracies, is a way to signal unified resolve against China's growing assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific without directly antagonizing Beijing. Making the Quad work could be President Biden's most important task in Asia, but doing so requires a specific agenda that builds on shared goals. It is not just about China, it's really about getting Asia right. To be clear, while there is a security consulting part to the Quad, it is not a formal treaty and it is not a military alliance. There are no collective security commitments within the Quad regime. With the conclusion of the Quad Summit, several opportunities for our industries to partner and harmonize efforts with government support have emerged. The deliverables were impressive. In addition to the maritime security cooperation usually associated with the Quad, President Biden and his counterparts agreed on a major COVID-19 vaccine initiative for the region. The 4 leaders also agreed to strengthen cooperation on securing supplies of rare earth metals, driven by a dependence on China for these critical inputs to technology and defense production at a time when Beijing is slapping boycotts on any country that displeases it. The 4 governments formed a critical and emerging technology working group. The point of this group is for the 4 countries to collaborate on telecommunications and on technology standards. This working group is tasked with convening dialogues on critical technology supply chains, which is a direct reference to the attempt to shut out China from any technology or raw materials that would have dual civilian and military application. It has also been set up to encourage cooperation on telecommunications deployment, diversification of equipment suppliers, and future telecommunications. Additional areas for industrial cooperation include cybersecurity monitoring and remediation. As noted throughout this discussion this morning, securing supply chains to create resilience and to expand supply diversification. Pursuing 5G and beyond 5G technologies to ensure secure communications infrastructure, and to pursue collaborative research and development and deployment of beyond 5G technologies. Working with industry to provide an alternative to Chinese digital entanglements in the Indo-Pacific, to include development in less affluent countries. And finally, to develop a human capital network from our diverse scientific and technical communities, both in government and industry. So the way I see it, a rich menu of opportunities whereby we have 4 nations who collectively represent a quarter of the world's population, and by some accounts, over 30 trillion in GDP. We now possess a combined sense of urgency, focus, and a clearer view of the coercion and vulnerability we collectively have with respect to China. The question is, can we together pave a path forward to success and agree how best to do so? The world is watching and China's not waiting. Thank you very much.
ウェブスターさん、どうもありがとうござい
Mr.
ました。
Webster, thank you very much for that.
大変時間が伸びてしまいまして、当初の予定から
We are very much
すでに20分
behind schedule.
なかなか
We're
もう一度
already 20 minutes past the allotted
司会者としても
moderator. I have received a lot of questions,
Today,
and I've seen a lot of very
our
wide-ranging
questions are
questions.
quite
There are
large
many,
in
many
number
questions that have
and
come
very
to me.
broad in nature.
And it's
So I
very
apologize
broad,
for
the
this.
subject, and unfortunately, we're not in a position to be able to deal with them all. The most important one, I think, is an international national security question. Myself, regularly, I exchange views with China, and because of the Quad, they feel surrounded, and they have a very strong sense of crisis. On the one hand, China has aggressive behavior, but they are on high alert because of the Quad. It's a bit of a spiral phenomenon. Certainly, since Xi Jinping took office, they have made it very clear what they're aiming for. And they have made it clear that they don't intend to let anything stand in their way. They've surprised various countries by their hardline stance, and that's provoked opposition. As the discussion broadens, the focus will be how the U.S. moves, I believe. And so I'm sorry, but I have just one question for Mr. Webster to conclude our program. Mr. Webster, you pointed out that the U.S. is first taking care of its domestic problems. That's certainly extremely important. If domestic affairs are not in order, then you cannot mobilize your country vis-a-vis the international community. So since the Trump era, I think there's rather serious domestic division. And my question has something to do with the political calendar. But there are midterm elections 2 years after a president takes office. And that depends not so much on the international situation, but midterm elections are pretty much a referendum on domestic affairs. So to put it another way, the Biden administration will probably for 2 years be focused on domestic stability and trying to get a victory in the midterms, and only then start focusing on focusing policy. There was a meeting recently in Alaska, and it appears that the Biden administration doesn't think it has sufficient time. And I think that it was a rather calculated answer to Young Jechi's 12-minute, very long answers that didn't even pause for interpreting. And his angry speech was not directed at the US, it was for domestic consumption. I think it was only a speech to Xi Jinping to show Xi Jinping, look, I'm doing my job. It's rather unfortunate. It means that diplomacy is not functioning. Diplomats can only speak to their own domestic public. It's like Yosuke Matsuoka's speech when Japan left the League of Nations in the pre-war era. So it's conceivable that the US might not have enough time. So you gave a lot of detail in your presentation, but here's my question for you, Mr. Webster. For the next 2 years, President Biden will be spending a lot of time on domestic affairs, but he will also have to think about the international situation and national security. He will have to manage his policy agenda with a very delicate, difficult balance. And for the US, and considering this Quad, should focus be given to China or Russia, which is getting close to China, or NATO, which also has concerns about China? Should more consideration be given also to Russia and NATO, for example? What kind of policy balance do you see the administration taking over these 2 years?
Okay, thank you so much. There's quite a lot to unpack there, and I'll do my best. First of all, I want to make it very clear, I don't speak for the Biden administration. I work for the largest lobbying organization in the United States, the US Chamber of Commerce. But I do work very closely with people in the administration, many of whom I worked for and grew up with. So I'll try to answer this as best I can as a citizen. First of all, I think it was Winston Churchill who said democracies are untidy or messy. Democracy is untidy and messy. It definitely is. And the past 4 years for America have been a difficult period domestically and internationally. I'm a strong believer in alliances. I agree with the Secretary General of NATO, who agrees with this administration that the strength of America is with its allies and its close partners. There is no way with, what is that called, truesize.com, when you put these alliances, land masses together in close partnerships like India, if we collectively put that true size together, we definitely are much bigger than China and Russia together. This administration has made it clear that their focus is on Asia. The administration will minimize its focus on the Middle East. It is working vigorously to reassure NATO and the EU, that America will fulfill its commitments and is definitely part of the team. This year is the year of what one administration official said is the year of the apology tour, spending time to reassure our close friends and allies around the world that America is there. The question for the world, and I know this, I've been on a couple of webinars. There was a diplomat in Germany who asked this question: is Trump the anomaly or is Biden the anomaly? I mean, that is a stark reality. It was a difficult question. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I personally thought of the Trump years as an anomaly. To your point, midterm elections, we will have to see what happens. The election, the popular vote, which Biden won, it was not a wide margin. A significant amount of Americans voted for Trump or for the party, GOP. So midterm elections will matter. Part of the urgency of this administration to succeed in what it did in passing a huge COVID pandemic economic stimulus package was to reassure Americans of all political flavors that this administration is providing for them. And that's with the midterm election in mind as well. Secondly, this infrastructure bill is the second urgent matter underway right now to do a couple of things, and with the midterm election in mind as well. One of the things this administration recognizes right from the beginning is that anxiety over China and its impact on our national security is a bipartisan concern. So if this administration is looking for something that has bipartisan support, it's infrastructure investment. And as the administration talks more soon about its infrastructure proposal, you will see intended significant investments in areas of R&D and development that are areas of anxiety with respect to China. So various technology concerns. We have been slipping, diminishing our R&D investments decade over decade, and this is an awakening. And so the bipartisan parts of the infrastructure bill will be investments to counter anxiety over China and their technology growth. And secondly, other infrastructure investments that American citizens can realize immediately, such as roads and bridges and mass transit. All of this is with the midterm in mind. This administration is working very hard in year one to deliver on all of these bills, which would hopefully resonate well with the voter and be reflected with at least maintaining the number of seats in the House and Senate they have today, if not growing a few extra seats in the midterm, as opposed to losing seats. So that's a very quick overview. I hope that is helpful with your question. At the same time, to close, this administration is a well-experienced group of internationalists. And while it's important to focus on domestic issues, there's a lot that needs to be done here, especially due to the pandemic, as in any nation, certainly here online. But at the same time, they're equally working to reassure and rebuild confidence globally, while also looking very strategically at the vulnerabilities. And again, as I said, the national security strategy of this administration, they've published an interim, the final will be published this summer, will reinforce what the Trump administration focused on, the great power competition. First and foremost, US versus China. And then secondly, US versus Russia and the impact of that power competition, especially in Europe. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much. That was a very thorough answer. To close, let me share some of my personal experience with you all. It's about 8 years ago. I visited Brent Scowcroft. He was doing very well, and we had a discussion about the threat of China. And my question was, in the 70s, vis-a-vis the USSR, the US played the China card. Couldn't we play a Russia card vis-a-vis China? With the Japanese foreign minister, we were behind the scenes talking about whether a 2+2 should be done with Russia. And what General Scowcroft told me was that theoretically, yes, but when you consider the China card that was played and the current Russia card, it's much more of a wild card than that China card was. After our 2+2 meeting, Russia showed just how wild it was by taking over the Crimea. China and Russia are two fronts that the US faces. And I believe that that's a difficult set of issues. And other countries are also active in the Far East. So I believe that India, Australia, and Japan can be a very important support to the US in its Asia policy. It's most regrettable that I don't have enough time to handle questions to all of the panelists, and we also lost our interpreting sound for a while. I'm very sorry about that. We will be announcing our next event on our website. I would very much like to pursue this quad dialogue further. Thank you so much to everyone listening, to all the panelists for sticking with us for such a long time this evening. Thank you very much.